Council leaders of all the riot-torn big cities have urged Mrs. Thatcher to launch a package of reflationary measures to soften the recession. The Labour-controlled Association of Metropolitan Authorities, which represents major cities like London, Liverpool, Manchester and Leeds, wants the government to spend an extra £6,000 million this year on investment, jobs and housing. It warns that if present policies are continued, the economic results will be unacceptable. Hundreds of men and women have been appearing in magistrates' courts all over the country to answer charges connected with the riots. Most have been remanded, but among sentences handed out today were 9 months jail for a looter, 6 months for attacking police, 4 months for threatening behaviour, and 3 months for possessing an offensive weapon. Several youths have been sent to detention centres, and some placed under a nighttime curfew. And in the West Midlands, the Chief Constable said several of those arrested in local disturbances came from outside the area. From Birmingham, Patrick Burns reports.
The friends and relatives of people arrested during the disturbances crammed into Birmingham's court buildings. Such was the weight of the court's business that some cases were hurriedly transferred to courtrooms not normally brought into use for the magistrates. More than 360 people, black and white, have been appearing in court in the West Midlands in connection with the weekend disturbances. They face charges ranging from public order offences, threatening behaviour, causing an affray, to criminal damage, theft and possessing offensive weapons. A single detective represented the police in court in Birmingham today. He said the officers who'd actually carried out the arrests were unable to appear because they were now resting after their weekend duty, so they could again be in readiness tonight. He opposed applications for bail on the grounds, he said, that the police feared a possible upsurge of similar incidents. Nearly all the defendants were remanded either in custody or in juvenile care, as the police requested. But did they think extreme political groups had been involved in the rioting?
Certainly members of certain political groupings were seen about on the streets that night. The only evidence we have of people coming from outside that I know of is the fact that certain people who were arrested in Handsworth in connection with petrol bombs came from London.
Last night saw yet more disturbances in a number of cities, and the trouble spread to Scotland for the first time when clashes broke out in Dundee. And today the Police Federation chairman, Jim Jardine, hit out angrily at what he called the bleeding hearts who do nothing but complain about police brutality. He told a Federation meeting, "I am sick to the stomach because in the last few days the police have not been able to stop the homes and livelihoods of ordinary decent citizens from being destroyed. It is time," he said, "to stop pussyfooting. It is time to make bold decisions. Let our members get after the rioters and looters, and let us stop worrying about what other people will say afterwards." Among last night's worst disturbances were those in the Chapeltown area of Leeds, where, for the second night running, mainly black youths went on the rampage. The troubles there have seriously upset community relations, as John Thirlwell reports.
Even as Chapeltown burned last night with the riot at its height, police said they could detect the hand of professional agitators directing and guiding the looters. Today, several people who used CB radios to help marshal the looting were being questioned by police. At daybreak, the majority of the residents who had not been involved in the trouble came out onto the streets to survey the damage. It was plain to behold. Less visible but equally apparent was the damage to community relations. For the last 3 years, Chapeltown has been the subject of an experiment in community policing, with bobbies on the beat working to improve relations between police and inhabitants. So well was the experiment working that only 2 weeks before the riots, several thousand people had taken part in a march expressing the racial harmony of the area. In fact, relations were so good that community workers who know the area well are in no doubt that the riots were caused by outsiders.
If it is not to get worse, one is going to have to look at what is happening and see that a number of people who are in the area agitating, leading, directing will have to be shifted out.
Now, how are you going to be able to contact those people?
I don't think it's for us to contact them. I think it's a job for the police.
But are you prepared to help the police doing that?
I think the total community is prepared to help the police. Because remember this, the majority of the people in Chapeltown aren't rioting. It's a small minority.
Now, Northern Ireland. Following the death of another hunger striker early this morning, there have been renewed calls for the British government to talk directly with the protesting prisoners in the maze. The calls came from Cardinal O'Fee, Roman Catholic Primate of all Ireland, who praised the work of the Irish Commission for Justice and Peace. He said he accepted their account of last week's failed negotiations. And they came from Professor James Doog, the new Irish Foreign Minister, who had a private talk with Lord Carrington in Brussels, where they're both attending a common market meeting. Martin Herson, the hunger striker who died this morning, was serving 20 years for explosives offences and for plotting to kill members of the security forces. He was on his 46th day without food, but his death came as something of a surprise, since 2 other hunger strikers have been fasting longer. Brian Hanrahan reports.
The unexpected death of Martin Herson was relayed to empty streets. The security forces braced themselves for the familiar reaction, but in only a few places where people gathered was there wholesale stoning. 2 soldiers were slightly wounded in shooting incidents, but generally this was a level of violence far below even the diminished troubles that followed the death of the last hunger striker. But if street pressures are lessening, Stormont still faces others. Cardinal O'Fee has thrown his weight behind the proposals of the Catholic Commission for Justice and Peace, particularly their suggestion that a government official be sent into the maze to talk directly to the prisoners. In doing so, he's echoing a statement made earlier today by the Irish Prime Minister, Dr. Fitzgerald, the text of which was conveyed to Lord Carrington during an EEC meeting in Brussels. And it's this form of international pressure that the government has always been more likely to heed. But today's annual Orange Parade remind of another pressure the government cannot ignore. Across Northern Ireland, the Protestant majority marched in their familiar and disciplined tens of thousands. So far, they've been mostly silent onlookers of the hunger strike, but their leaders would be quick to condemn any settlement they regarded as too soft or any prison reforms too much like political status.
At the Old Bailey, 3 alleged members of the extreme Protestant Ulster Volunteer Force have been given sentences ranging from 3 to 7 years on charges of supplying and possessing explosive substances. The 3 men were said to be part of a UVF operation to send weed killer through Glasgow to Northern Ireland for use as an explosive by terrorists. One of the longest trials in British legal history has ended with 3 international drug dealers found guilty of murder. The jury in the so-called Handless Corpse case at Lancaster took 5 days to reach their unanimous verdict in a trial that's lasted 120 days. Alexander Sinclair, a New Zealander who operated under many names, was convicted of murder and conspiracy to import drugs. He was the leader of the drug ring and ordered the death of his former partner, Martin Johnson. James Smith from West Lothian and Keith Kirby of Lancashire were also found guilty of murdering Johnson, whose mutilated body was found in a flooded quarry. 2 others, Andrew Marr of Lancashire and Frederick Russell of London, had already admitted murder. 4 other defendants were found guilty on drug charges and 3 more acquitted. On the case's international background, David Davis reports.
Eccleston Quarry near Chorley in Lancashire is popular with amateur divers, but in October 1979 it was sheer chance that the handless and mutilated body of Christopher Martin Johnston was discovered. But the murder of the co-founder of one of the world's richest and most violent drug syndicates was anything but an accident. It was ordered by the syndicate's leader, Terry Clark, already wanted in connection with several murders in Australia, but living in Britain under the name Sinclair. He believed Johnston had been cheating the syndicate and cheating him of even bigger profits from drug smuggling than he'd made already.
Yes, he must have been one of the top drug dealers in the world. Certain it is that he's made a lot of money out of drugs, and at one time it was alleged that he was worth £50 million.
These were just some of the aliases and passports of Terry Sinclair that helped him travel the world, buying and selling vast quantities of heroin and cocaine. There was Robert Andrew Gorry in Australia in 1979. Alexander James Sinclair, also in Australia, 1979. Dennis Michael Casey, New Zealand passport, 1975. Peter Hayfron, British passport, 1979. And Norman Perkins, Australian passport, 1976. Peter Criss had an Australian passport, 1977. And John Eli Newton, another Australian passport, a month later. All the aliases, all the passports belonged to this one man, and he it was who ordered Marty Johnston's murder. Johnston was driving north on the A6 near Lancaster when he was shot in the head by another syndicate member. At a nearby garage, his hands were cut off to try to prevent identification. Previous syndicate victims had suffered a similar fate. Weights totalling 170 pounds were tied to his neck, legs and ankles. And then Marty Johnston's body was quite literally unloaded from the back of a car into Eccleston Quarry.
Scotland Yard say that 76 people have been arrested throughout the country following a 5-month investigation into a £500,000 social security fraud. There were over 40 arrests in London, with others detained in Manchester, Edinburgh and Glasgow. Police are also hunting the source of forged social security payment books. The first parliamentary test for the Social Democrats is now only 3 days away. At the Warrington by-election, their man faces 10 other candidates. Opinion polls say Labour will win again, with the Social Democrats second. But their candidate, Mr. Roy Jenkins, who helped to launch the party after years in the Common Market and before that in Labour governments, says he's winning converts all the time. Brian Curtoys has been looking at Warrington, the campaign and the constituency.
For Roy Jenkins, former president of the European Commission, wooing voters in a Labour stronghold on a Warrington council estate is a long way from the diplomatic manoeuvring in Brussels. But Mr. Jenkins, who's proved himself something of a political Pied Piper, found some support for the Social Democrats' cause.
Yes, I agree with you entirely there. I don't like this left side of Labour at all.
Well,
no.
I quite agree with you, and that's
Yes.
represented here, so I hope they're my true supporters.
Yes.
And I think we've got a real chance of making a breakthrough here. And if we do, we'll change the whole face of British politics.
Warrington has been a safe Labour seat since the war, so it's never been in the political limelight. The constituency takes in the inner core of the town. It's an important manufacturing centre with many trades, engineering, soap powder, wire-making and breweries, including the famous vodka. But like most other communities, Warrington has been hit hard by the recession, and unemployment has doubled in a year to nearly 13%. These conditions should guarantee unwavering support for Labour, and the problem for the SDP, with Liberal backing, is to shake that confidence. So at the weekend, they brought in their big guns. All their leaders turned up to try to impress the town's doubters and don't-knows. Shadow Chancellor Peter Shaw was one of several leading Labour figures who came to speak for their candidate, Doug Hoyle. Mr. Hoyle, MP for nearby Nelson and Colne until the last election, is a senior union official. When he walks Warrington streets, unemployment is his constant theme.
I'm finding a lot of people in Warrington very concerned about employment, very concerned about the high cost of living, and they really are saying to me quite plainly, we do need a change, and we need a change of government. That's right. And what they're saying is, well, we want to get a good result here so we can speak for Britain, because they believe...
Mr. Hoyle's a left-wing member of Labour's National Executive and a supporter of unilateral disarmament. He's playing down that role, and he won't say whether he backs Mr. Tony Benn. But the people of Warrington are left in no doubt that he believes the government's policies are endangering their future. For the Conservatives, law and order has been a principal platform. With the constituency midway between Liverpool and Manchester, the riots there prompted the Conservative candidate Stan Sorrell, a bus driver from London, to warn the Home Secretary himself, William Whitelaw, just what his plans are.
When I'm elected Member of Parliament for Warrington, I will campaign for the return of capital punishment and also corporal punishment.
And Mr. Sorrell, a surprise choice for the Conservatives, was advocating fines for parents the day before the government's announcement. But he's having a hard job defending the government's record, particularly on unemployment. There's speculation he could even lose his deposit. But there are 8 more candidates. Neil Chantrell, Ecology Party, wants more investment in energy's natural resources. Donald Keane, a second Social Democrat, says he founded the party first. The other 6, John Fleming, Independent Labour, Daniel Hussey, United Democratic Party, Ian Leslie, Citizens Band Radio, Thomas Keane, campaigning for a prosperous Britain, Harry Wise, English Democratic Party, and veteran campaigner William Boakes, Public Safety Democratic Monarchist. As the final preparations are made at the Town Hall for Thursday's by-election, Warrington still looks like staying Labour. But the size of their majority will depend on the number of voters who switch to the Social Democrats. They are confident that they'll at least push the Conservatives into third place. But they know they must do more than that, and it's a stiff task. Unless they can win 30 to 35% of the votes cast, then their chances of achieving a permanent political breakthrough are going to be seriously undermined.
Poland's Communist Party opens its emergency congress in Warsaw tomorrow to decide what reforms are to be allowed and to plan for economic recovery. Our Eastern Europe correspondent, Tim Sebastian, looks at what the Congress is likely to achieve.
The Soviet delegation isn't of the highest caliber, but it got a top-level welcome nonetheless. After all, this Congress is as much for them as for anyone else. The Polish leadership has to persuade Moscow that the country is now under firm control and heading in the right direction. The Russians have indicated they'll make up their own minds. To help them, there are enough of the old-style trimmings dotted around the capital, but the slogans no longer promise the earth. For this Communist Party is trying to pick itself up after a year on its knees. It still has a long way to go. And within the communist framework, delegates will try to find room for maneuver, more democratic procedures, and the use of secret ballots. Ironically, the Congress takes place in the building given to the Poles by Stalin, who had other ideas for it. Solidarity certainly had altogether different ideas. Bus drivers struck in Kutno, west of Warsaw, for 2 hours today against food shortages, the town's idea of pre-Congress persuasion. Most people came away from the shops today with just bread and milk, hardly a diet for a stable society. So whatever the Congress decides this week, there still won't be any quick end to the crisis here. The conflicts with Solidarity and the labour disputes seem likely to go on. But what the Communist Party may be able to do is unite amongst its own ranks and end the constant struggle for power. If it can't, there isn't any hope at all of a return to normality. Tim Sebastian, BBC, Warsaw.
The Archbishop of Canterbury has been revealing something of his talks with Prince Charles and Lady Diana about the wedding, and he's had a message for the public. They should share the day with the royal couple by reaffirming their own marriage vows. Richard Whitmore reports.
While admitting that he's not had a lot of practice at conducting weddings of late, Dr. Runcie hasn't confined himself simply to discussing arrangements for the service in his talks with the royal couple. They'd impressed him with their serious approach as loyal Christians, he said, and he had advised them a little about the responsibilities of marriage, about the support each must give the other, and about bringing up children. It seems the couple didn't take long to decide that Lady Diana, in her vows, would not promise to obey.
Well, I put the question to them, and we had a short discussion about it, but it was fairly quickly agreed that it would be appropriate to follow the order of service, which doesn't include the word obey, which was the main agreed text in the 1928 revision. Of course, there is a permission to reintroduce the word obey, but it seems to me that this is an example of the way in which the royal couple are in general like other couples today.
Did you regard it as an unusual decision?
No, I rather expected it.
With the St. Paul's ceremony likely to be seen by 500 million people around the world, Dr. Runcie hopes that those watching the service will, in a sense, also participate.
Well, I hope very much that it will be seen as an emphasis once again on the Christian objective of marriage as lifelong relationship, and it's not just Christian, it seems to me to be at the very heart of the institution of marriage itself, for better, for worse, for richer, for poorer, in sickness and in health. And that's what I hope may be renewed, and I, of course, have suggested that those who are watching might take this part of the whole glorious event quietly, and for many people, and this is an advantage of having the traditional form of service, the vows will be what they themselves once took, and it will be a very good occasion to renew them and for couples to rededicate themselves quietly and silently.
And finally, the main points of the news again. The Home Secretary, Mr. Whitelaw, after all the riot arrests, is going to use army camps to make more room in the prisons. Mrs. Thatcher has said the riots have given her the most worrying time since she became Prime Minister. And there are fresh moves to end the H-Block hunger strike after the death of the 6th man to go on the fast. Well, that's the news tonight. Good night.